U-35 was a diesel-electric submarine of the Imperial German Navy, renowned as one of the most effective submarines of World War I. It belonged to the U-31 class, which included submarines numbered from U-31 to U-41, and was designed as a universal project combining the capabilities of both small and medium-sized submarines of that time. This class allowed it to operate effectively in both coastal waters and the open sea, including the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean. The U-35 was designed by engineer Hans Tychl, and the boat was laid down on December 20, 1912, at Friedrich Krupp's famous shipyard in Kiel. The launch took place on April 18, 1914, and on November 3 of the same year, just months before the start of active hostilities, U-35 was incorporated into the German Imperial Navy. Its first commander was Lieutenant Commander Waldemar Kochemal, under whose command the boat served until August 1915. Initially, U-35 was part of the second flotilla of the submarine fleet and was based in the German archipelago of Heligoland. However, from August 23, 1915, until the end of the war, the boat operated as part of the so-called Pol Flotilla, an operational group providing support to the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Adriatic. At the same time, U-35 was formally included in the Austro-Hungarian fleet, which allowed it to operate legitimately in the Mediterranean Sea. During 3 years of active service, the boat had 4 commanders, but the most famous of them was Lothar von Arnaud de la Perrière, under whose command U-35 achieved record results in terms of the number of ships sunk. In total, the boat made 2 training and 19 combat missions, during which it sank 226 ships, including both military and merchant vessels, and damaged another 10. By today's standards, the total armament of the U-35 submarine would seem quite modest, only 6 torpedoes and 1 deck artillery gun. However, it was with this arsenal that the crew managed to conduct extremely successful combat operations. During patrols and combat missions, the submarine sank enemy ships with both torpedo attacks and artillery fire. But these methods were not limited to that. Many ships were boarded, their crews were ordered to abandon ship, after which the ship was blown up with explosives or simply flooded by opening the Kingstons. Such actions were more economical and allowed torpedoes to be saved for truly defensible targets. Although these submarines were called submarines, they were essentially surface ships with the ability to dive for short periods of time. Most of their movement took place on the surface, and diving was usually used for surprise attacks, evading pursuit, or covert maneuvers. The technical limitations were significant. The maximum diving depth was 50 meters, and the time spent underwater was limited to a few hours due to a lack of oxygen and the accumulation of carbon dioxide, which quickly became toxic. The speed on the surface was about 30 kilometers per hour, which was considered a decent indicator at the time, and the range in the surface position reached 14,000 kilometers, which allowed it to operate in remote areas. However, underwater, the boat could only reach speeds of up to 18 kilometers per hour, and its range was limited to approximately 130 kilometers, or several hours of electric propulsion. By comparison, modern nuclear submarines are truly underwater ships capable of remaining submerged for months, and in theory, up to 10 years. They can easily operate at depths of 500 meters or more without experiencing critical air or energy limitations. They obtain oxygen from seawater, processing it using special systems, and carbon dioxide is neutralized using scrubbers. Energy comes from nuclear reactors, which makes the boat autonomous for years. The only real limitations are provisions for the crew and the psychological state of people who find it difficult to stay in a confined underwater space for a long time. The U-35 was undoubtedly a product of its time. Its capabilities were extremely limited by modern standards, but in those circumstances, given the tactics, discipline of the crew, effective organization of raids, and experience of the commanders, it was able to achieve phenomenal results. 226 ships sunk and 10 damaged is an outstanding achievement that no submarine in history has yet been able to surpass. When Germany entered World War I in 1914, its fleet consisted of only 24 submarines. At that time, the use of submarines as weapons seemed experimental, an interesting technological innovation, but not a combat-proven weapon. The admirals of the world's leading powers, Great Britain, France, and Russia, viewed submarines with suspicion, considering them suitable only for limited defense of coastal waters. They were perceived more as an auxiliary element of the fleet than as a full-fledged strike force. However, just 1 month after the start of the war, these views were radically revised. On September 5, 1914, the German submarine U-21, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Otto Herzing, caused a real sensation. It ambushed and torpedoed the British light cruiser HMS Pathfinder off the east coast of Scotland. The explosion detonated the ammunition, and the cruiser sank in just 5 minutes, taking the lives of 259 sailors. This was the first time in history that a submarine had sunk a warship with a torpedo, and the event shocked both the British command and the public. But this was only the beginning. On September 22, less than 3 weeks later, U-9, commanded by another lieutenant commander, Otto Weddigen, carried out an unprecedented raid in the North Sea. In less than 2 hours, it sank 3 British armored cruisers, HMS Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy. These ships, patrolling hostile waters without sufficient cover and anti-submarine protection, were easy prey. In just one morning, more than 36,000 tons of displacement sank to the bottom and 1,459 British sailors were killed. This event caused shock in Great Britain and marked a new understanding of the threat posed by submarines. After this incident, the German military leadership's attitude towards submarines changed dramatically. From a dubious auxiliary tool, they instantly became an important strategic resource. Active development of tactics for their combat use began, along with expansion of the submarine fleet and planning of large-scale operations against British shipping. The next episode, confirming the growing boldness and tactical flexibility of German submariners, took place on October 20th. Submarine U-17, operating off the coast of neutral Norway, stopped the British merchant steamer Glitra. The submarine commander acted in accordance with the rules of prize law at the time. He allowed the crew to leave the ship, then ordered the Kingstons, special valves through which water began to flow into the hold, to be opened. The steamer sank without a single casualty. The sailors from the Glitra were picked up by a Norwegian vessel that had unwittingly witnessed the incident but did not intervene, as Norway officially maintained neutrality. The actions of the crew of the U-17 submarine off the coast of Norway formally complied with the norms of international maritime law in force at the beginning of the 20th century. According to these norms, before attacking a civilian or merchant ship, a submarine was obliged to warn the crew and allow sufficient time for all people to safely leave the ship. Only then could the ship be destroyed, for example, by opening the Kingston valves or detonating explosives. This provision, known as prize law, allowed naval warfare to be conducted while maintaining humanitarian standards. In the early months of World War I, German submariners strictly adhered to these rules. Submarine commanders, despite technical limitations and dangers, acted with caution, showing respect for maritime conventions. Exceptions were made only in cases where an armed enemy appeared on the horizon, military ships or merchant ships that could pose a threat to the submarine itself. In such situations, submariners could attack without prior warning, based on the principles of self-defense. However, as the conflict developed and the fighting intensified, the situation changed rapidly. Just 6 days after the Glitra incident, on October 26, 1914, the same U-17 struck the French passenger ferry Admiral Ganteaume in the English Channel. At that moment, there were about 2,000 Belgian refugees on board, fleeing the horrors of war. The ferry was seriously damaged by the torpedo attack. Although the crew tried to save the ship, and it remained afloat for some time, it soon sank. At least 40 people died in this tragic episode. The rest were rescued by ships that came to their aid. This incident was a wake-up call. The war at sea was entering a new, more brutal phase. Germany, realizing the strategic power of submarines and their potential in fighting the superior forces of the British Navy, changed its priorities. Merchant shipping, previously considered a secondary target, now became the main target of attacks. The goal was obvious: to deal a crushing blow to the enemy's economy by disrupting the supply and transport of vital cargo. This was to be a response to the long-range naval blockade that Britain had been gradually tightening against Germany itself since the beginning of the conflict. As a result of this escalation, in November 1914, just 3 months after the start of the war, the British Admiralty declared the North Sea a war zone. Despite numerous protests from neutral states such as the United States, the Netherlands, and Sweden, Britain stubbornly insisted on the need for a total naval blockade of Germany. Official London claimed that these measures were a necessary strategy in the context of total war, aimed at exhausting the enemy and cutting off supplies of weapons and food. The British interpretation of international law contained more and more flexible interpretations that allowed them to ignore the old rules of maritime warfare in order to achieve their strategic goals. Against this backdrop, the German military leadership gradually became convinced that if England had effectively refused to abide by international rules and was waging war without regard for morality and law, then Germany had every reason to act similarly, especially with regard to the new and powerful means of naval warfare, submarines. It was decided to use submarines not as a limited means of defense or precision strike, but as a full-fledged strategic weapon of counter-blockade. German admirals believed that the massive and systematic destruction of the British and Allied merchant fleet with the help of submarines would sooner or later lead to the economic collapse of Britain, cause internal discontent, and ultimately force London to surrender or at least negotiate. Since the British had ceased to spare the German economy and civilian population, Germany, in the opinion of its command, was no longer obliged to observe moral restrictions on methods of warfare at sea. Submarines were allowed to sink enemy ships without warning, even if there were civilians on board. According to the new logic, the crews of steamships were considered part of the enemy's military machine and therefore not subject to mercy. This decision, extremely controversial and cruel, was explained by the need for military balance in the context of Britain's complete naval dominance. The German public, experiencing acute shortages of food, fuel, and basic necessities under the growing blockade, generally supported this radical decision. People wanted a response, retribution for the suffering caused by the actions of the British fleet. However, Germany faced a serious problem. At that time, it still did not have enough submarines to conduct an effective and large-scale submarine campaign. The construction of new submarines was underway, but it required time, resources, and coordinated efforts. Nevertheless, there was practically no choice. The British Royal Navy significantly outnumbered the German Navy, and the battleships of the Kaiser's fleet were effectively locked in the ports of the North Sea. Any attempt to bring large formations out into the open sea threatened defeat. Submarines remained the only tool capable of operating covertly, effectively, and independently. The final straw that prompted the transition to unrestricted submarine warfare was the secret orders issued by the British Admiralty on January 31 and February 10, 1915. These instructions, addressed to the captains of British merchant ships, described in detail methods of defense against submarines. They contained recommendations on repainting ships to conceal their true affiliation, removing names and ports of registry from the stern, raising the flags of neutral countries, especially the United States and Scandinavian countries, and changing the appearance of ships to disguise them as civilian or neutral vessels. With the start of a new phase of submarine warfare, the tactics of the submarines themselves also changed. Whereas previously maritime law required stopping a ship, conducting an inspection, allowing the crew to leave the ship, and only then sinking it, this practice was now impossible. In a situation where merchant ships began to actively use deception techniques, and some even turned into traps, submarine commanders received clear instructions. No more warnings, no raising of flags, and no approaching for inspection. If a target was detected, it was to be attacked immediately without warning. This decision was based not only on changing moral attitudes, but also on a growing threat. Instead of obediently complying with orders to stop, more and more merchant ships began to take active defensive measures. If a ship was unarmed, captains were ordered to immediately change course and attempt to ram a submarine when it surfaced. Furthermore, the British Admiralty issued instructions to arm civilian ships with hidden cannons and machine guns disguised as deck structures. These traps, later known as Q-ships, were specifically designed to lure German submarines and destroy them when they surfaced, when they were most vulnerable. This radically changed the rules of the game. Whereas previously the crews of sunken ships were at least formally given a chance to escape, now the destruction was swift and merciless. In an effort to survive and avoid being destroyed when surfacing, submarines began to act preemptively, torpedoing without warning and leaving before possible escorts appeared. Under such conditions, no one could be safe anymore. Even ships from neutral countries that found themselves in the war zone were now in mortal danger. Increasingly, British ships sailed under the flags of neutral countries, especially the United States or Scandinavian countries, abusing their status to avoid attacks. This only added to the chaos and confusion in the waters of the North Sea and the Atlantic. As a result of the British government's directive of January 31, 1915, which encouraged such tactics, Germany finally abandoned the old rules of warfare at sea. Despite the fact that at the beginning of 1915, the German fleet had only 27 combat-ready submarines at its disposal, success was not long in coming. Before the declaration of the war zone, German submarines managed to sink only 11 British steamships and 1 Allied vessel. But after the start of the active campaign, the results began to grow rapidly. By February 1915, German submarines had sunk 14 merchant ships with a total tonnage of 36,000 tons. 30 people were killed, which was considered a moderate level of losses at the time. In March, the results were even more impressive. 23 ships sunk, with a total displacement of 71,000 tons and 161 casualties. In April, 11 ships, 22,000 tons, and 38 deaths. This was only a prelude to the large-scale, unrestricted submarine warfare that unfolded later. Against this backdrop, the story of the submarine U-35, which is the subject of our video, becomes clearer. Unlike many of its counterparts, this submarine rarely took part in attacks on armed convoys or guarded targets. Its main focus was raids against small and medium-sized merchant ships, especially in the Mediterranean Sea. That is why, during its first 4 combat missions, the U-35 was able to sink 20 ships with a total tonnage of more than 29,000 tons. The combat missions of submarine U-35 initially took place in the North Sea and the Irish Sea, regions where the British fleet was particularly active, and fierce battles were fought for control of the sea lanes. However, during its 4th mission, the submarine made a daring crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. This was not only a technically difficult undertaking, but also a strategically important decision. The U-35 was transferred to the Mediterranean Sea, where the operational situation provided more opportunities to hunt Allied merchant ships with less threat from British convoys and escorts. Upon its arrival in the Mediterranean region, U-35 was based at 2 ports of the Allied Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the city of Kotor, now Kotor, Montenegro, and in Pula, now Pula, Croatia. These naval bases provided reliable shelter, repair facilities, and logistical support. Thanks to its advantageous geographical position, U-35 gained access to a number of busy sea routes used by ships carrying soldiers, weapons, food, and fuel to the Allied fronts. During the next 2 combat missions in the Mediterranean, U-35, under the command of experienced Captain Waldemar Kabasgamel, sank 14 transport ships and 2 more military vessels. These were precise, well-calculated attacks, demonstrating the commander's skill. For his outstanding service to the Navy, Kabasgamel was promoted to corvette captain in October 1915, a rank equivalent to a modern captain's 2nd rank. However, in December of the same year, he was transferred to a new position, commander of the submarine flotilla at the Pola base, where he began coordinating the actions of other submarines. He was replaced by a young, at that time still inexperienced officer, Lieutenant Lothar von Arnaud de la Perrière. This was his first command of a submarine, and his appointment raised certain doubts. However, he was incredibly lucky. The crew of U-35 already had 6 successful combat missions under their belt and were a close-knit, well-trained team of true professionals. Thanks to this, the new commander was able to quickly get into the rhythm and make the most effective use of the boat's combat capabilities. Under the command of Lothar von Arnaud de la Perrière, U-35 began its most successful and truly legendary phase of service. During 12 combat missions in the Mediterranean Sea, the submarine's crew demonstrated absolute mastery in the art of submarine warfare. A total of 192 transport ships, 3 auxiliary cruisers, 1 destroyer, and 1 patrol boat were sunk. In addition, 9 more transports and 1 patrol boat were seriously damaged. Arnaud de la Perrière often practiced unusual, almost chivalrous tactics. Before attacking, he gave the crews time to abandon ship. In doing so, he used not only torpedo attacks, but also artillery fire from deck guns, which allowed him to save torpedoes for more serious targets. On March 16, 1918, Arnaud de la Perrière left his post as commander of U-35. By that time, He had already become a living legend of the fleet and the most successful submariner of World War I. His track record included 194 ships sunk with a total tonnage of more than 450,000 tons. After leaving U-35, he received a new assignment, command of the newest ocean-going cruiser submarine U-139. Even at this stage, he did not slow down. On the new vessel, he added another 5 ships to his combat score. As a result, Lothar von Arnaud de la Perrière went down in history as the most successful submarine commander of all time, not only in World War I, but in the history of the submarine fleet as a whole. It should be noted that Captain Lothar von Arnaud de la Perrière, despite the intensification of the war and the escalation of violence at sea, adhered to the principles of prize law longer and more strictly than most of his colleagues. Contrary to the trend toward unrestricted submarine warfare, he developed his own tactics based on humanity, discipline, and respect for maritime law. Intercepted transport ships were usually first stopped with a warning shot from a deck gun. After stopping, the submarine crew was ordered to approach the ship, inspect it, and make sure that it was indeed a legitimate military target. For example, transporting weapons, military supplies, or violating the established blockade. If contraband cargo was found, the ship's crew was given time to evacuate in lifeboats, and only then was the ship destroyed, either by torpedo, artillery fire, or detonation of planted charges. This practice significantly reduced casualties among crews and passengers and earned the respect of even their opponents. It is not surprising that after the end of the war, Lothar von Arnaud de la Perrière was not included in the list of war criminals compiled by Great Britain, despite the enormous damage he had caused to the British merchant fleet. During the following 6 months, towards the end of the war, the U-35 submarine underwent a major overhaul, but did not carry out a single successful attack. Combat operations at sea gradually came to an end, and by the fall of 1918, it was clear that the war was nearing its end. After the armistice, U-35, like many other German warships, was interned, this time in the Spanish port of El Ferrol. As part of the post-war agreement, the submarine was handed over to Great Britain as part of reparations, and in 1920 it was dismantled for scrap metal in the docks of the city of Blyth. Thus ended the story of the most successful submarine of World War I. However, the phenomenal success of U-35 cannot be explained solely by the actions of its commander. The submarine's victories were the result of a whole complex of factors. First, it operated in an extremely advantageous region, the Mediterranean Sea, where shipping lanes were extremely busy. Ships sailed from Egypt, Malta, France, Italy, Greece, North Africa, and the Levant, carrying thousands of tons of cargo for the Allied armies. Second, there were virtually no effective anti-submarine defenses in this region. There was no aerial surveillance, no hydroacoustic systems, and no dense network of escort ships. In addition, a significant portion of the transport fleet, both military and civilian, was unarmed and did not have radio telegraphs. The captains of such ships were often unable to send distress signals and were unaware of submarine activity in the area. The lack of coordination between ships meant that each vessel became an easy and isolated target. Many captains, realizing the futility of resistance and hoping for the humanity of the enemy, preferred to surrender without a fight, especially since their ships were insured. They lowered the boats and left the ship without attempting to escape or ram the enemy. As a result, German submarines dealt a crushing blow to the Entente's maritime trade during World War I. In total, more than 5,000 merchant ships were sunk, amounting to over 12.8 million registered tons. In addition, 104 warships, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and minelayers, as well as 61 trap ships, the very same armed Q-ships created specifically for hunting submarines, were sent to the bottom. Despite the scale of the losses, the level of human casualties remained relatively low in many cases, especially after the introduction of the Allied convoy system. Thanks to this system, surviving ships were able to pick up the crews of sunken ships, which somewhat mitigated the brutal statistics of submarine warfare.